Welcome, everyone, to this panel titled, What do the US elections results tell us about the global trajectory of populism, organized by the European Center of Popular Studies, ECPS. My name is Nemes Tole, a PhD candidate at the University of Szeged in Hungary. With a thesis exploring populism in Africa, I'm also a non-residential fellow at the ECPS. Every so often, the ECPS creates these panel series, such as the Mapping European Populism and Mapping Global Populism, which explores the diverse expressions of populism worldwide. The aim is to build a nuanced, comprehensive understanding of populism on a global scale. In order to demonstrate our commitment to knowledge and knowledge dissemination, following the end of the session, that details the proceedings, along with sharing the recording on YouTube and our website. The recordings and panel publications are invaluable resources to scholars, policymakers, and the wider public who are concerned with the contemporary challenges populism and authoritarianism poses to global democracy. In our ongoing journey for the panel series, we extend our gratitude. Thank you to all the scholars and experts who have made time today to contribute their extensive insights. With this, I will continue to introduce our esteemed moderator and distinguished panelists for what I'm sure will be a really thought-provoking presentation and discussion today. Today, our panel moderated by Dr. Ali, Mr. Ali H. Aslan, who is a Washington-based senior journalist, a former Washington correspondent, and columnist of Zaman Daily. Mr. Aslan holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Turkey's prestigious Postdoctoral University. Immediately after college, he started a journalism career. He was assigned as a Washington correspondent of Zaman newspaper in 1997. He wrote weekly columns for Zaman and its English language affiliate, Today's Zaman. Specializes in international relations with a focus on US, Turkish, and Middle East relations. Mr. Aslan's work also appears occasionally on US publications such as Foreign Policy and European Affairs. Our first speaker will be Dr. Alan Abramowitz, who will present, whose presentation will be titled, It Was Mostly the Economy, Stupid, explaining Trump's victory. Dr. Abramowitz is a Alan Ben W. Barkley Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Emory College of Arts and Sciences. His research focuses on American politics, political parties, elections, and voting behavior. His current work examines party realignment in the US and its impact on presidential and congressional elections. Following Dr. Abramowitz, we'll have Dr. Jennifer McCoy, who will be speaking on the US election outcome and its implications for global populism. Dr. McCoy is a Regent Professor of Political Sciences at Georgia State University and non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as research affiliate at the CEU's Democracy Institute in Budapest. She was named a 2024 Andrew Carnegie Fellow for a project titled Migrating Pernicious Polarization Through Innovative Civic Educational Interventions. Her current book, titled The Polarizing Politics with Marcia, is under contract with Princeton University Press. Her latest volume, Polarizing Policies, A Global Threat to Democracy, is co-edited with Matt Sana, which was released in 2019. Dr. McCoy has a very wide area of expertise, including democratic resilience, democratic erosion, partisan polarization, crisis prevention, conflict resolution, democracy promotion, and collective defense, election processes, and international election observation, along with Latin American politics. Dr. McCoy served as director of the Carter Center's American Program between 1998 and 2015, leading projects on democratic strengthening, mediation, dialogue, and hemispheric cooperation. She's also edited dozens of articles and a few books. Our third speaker will be Dr. Marcia, who is a professor at the New York University and has held the Mercator Professorship in theology in the theology faculty of Humboldt University in Berlin. She continues to serve there as an annual guest professor and is a member of both the Center of Interreligious Theology and Religious Studies Institute in Berlin. In 2019 to 2020, she was a fellow at the Center of Theological Inquiry from Princeton. Her recent books include White Evangelicals and the Right-Wing Populism, How Did We Get Here? Second book is From This Broken Hill, I Will Sing to You, which looks like God, Sex, and Politics in the World of Leonard Connor. The third book is titled Commonwealth and the Covenant, which studies economics, politics, and theologies of rationality, America's New Evangelicals. Dr. Pali will talk on the role of white evangelicals in the 2024 US election, what we know so far. Dr. Mabel Berezin will be our fourth speaker and will delve into the question, does Trumpism cross the Atlantic? Dr. Berezin is a distinguished professor of arts and sciences in sociology and director of the Institute of European Studies at Cornell University. She writes on challenges to democratic cohesion and solidarity in Europe and the United States. She's working on The End of Security, on a book titled The End of Security and US Populism, and is under contract at Oxford. This book examines the current global resurgence of nationalism, populist challenges to democratic practices globally. And our final speaker will be Dr. Marina, who will make a presentation on the return of Trump and the future for global democracy. Dr. Nord is a postdoctoral research fellow at the V-Dem Institute, which is aligned with the University of Gothenburg, as well as a member of the German Research Network External Democracy Promotion. Her research focuses on explaining authorization and democratization processes, the interplay between economic processes and the political transformation. Before joining the V-Dem Institute, Dr. Marina Nord worked on several research projects at the Harty School and the German Institute for Economic Research, which became passionate about bridging the gap between academic research and policy domains. Wow. So from the bios I've covered, we have a very talented and broad spectrum of speakers. Remember, at the very end of today's panel presentations, we will have a question and answer session where we give participants the chance to write their questions in the chat box or raise a virtual hand to ask our presentations questions, thoughts, and any comments. Following that, I would like to now turn over the attention and authority to our esteemed moderator, Mr. Aslan, who will give us an overview of the panel subject matter and administer the panel. Mr. Aslan?
You are mute.
You're still muted.
Ali Aslan, you are mute.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Neo, for your kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the ECPS for the invitation. I look forward to engaging in this crucial discussion about the recent US general elections and their domestic and global ramifications. The United States is a constitutional republic and a representative democracy operating under a complex federal system that incorporates 50 states and the Federal District of Washington, D.C. At the federal level, the U.S. holds midterm elections every 2 years to fill all 435 seats in the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the 100 Senate seats. Every 4 years during general elections, presidential candidates are added to the ballot. The 2024 general election is one of those pivotal election years. Although there are minor parties, the US predominantly functions as a two-party system, with the conservative-leaning Republican Party and the liberal-leaning Democratic Party as the primary contenders. On November the 5th, in what was reported as a peaceful and orderly election, American voters decided to replace Democratic President Joe Biden in the White House with the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. President Biden, facing mounting concerns within his party about his age and health, especially after a faltering performance during his first televised debate with Trump, withdrew from the race less than 4 months before the election, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. In a heated and contentious campaign, former President Donald Trump, a prominent TV personality and businessman entangled in numerous legal controversies, survived 2 assassination attempts, his victory against Kamala Harris, an experienced yet a less charismatic candidate who struggled to distance herself from the economic challenges and unpopular policies of the Biden administration, was resounding. Trump secured remarkable electoral college wins at individual state level, capturing all key swing states with 312 electoral votes compared to Harris's 226. And remarkably, he also won the national popular vote by a margin of over 3 million votes. Trump's campaign, characterized by its anti-establishment rhetoric and focus on economic promises, anti-immigration stances, and appeals to religious and nationalist sentiments, galvanized his base. He managed to expand his coalition, making gains among traditionally Democratic groups, including Hispanic, African American, and Muslim American voters. The trend of working class voters leaving the Democratic Party continued in this election. Capitalizing on discontent with President Biden, the Republicans also flipped the Senate, securing at least 53 seats, and Republicans just today actually took control of House of Representatives with a narrow majority. Historically, instances have occurred where one party controlled both the White House and Congress in the United States. However, it is unprecedented for such an anti-establishment figure like Trump to wield substantial influence over both branches. The Supreme Court continues to have a majority, a conservative majority, shaped significantly by appointments made during Trump's first term. Critics worry that this concentration of power could undermine democratic institutions, setting a precedent for authoritarianism globally. Yet others believe that America's robust democratic framework and constitutional traditions remain strong enough to withstand those pressures. The unpredictable nature of President-elect Trump, one of America's most polarizing and powerful figures, makes forecasting his second term, which will start on January 20th, difficult. In fact, perhaps the most predictable thing about second Trump term is its unpredictability. His initial selections for key government roles offer a mixed outlook. Some appointees align with traditional US foreign policy stances, while others echo Trump's anti-establishment views, particularly in the Justice Department and the Pentagon, pending Senate confirmation. In light of these uncertain times, we have an esteemed panel of experts ready to analyze the forces behind Trump's victory and the future holds for the US and the world. We made a small change in our program flow because Dr. McCoy will be able to stay for about 1 hour with us. I'm honored to invite her as our first speaker. And Dr. McCoy is Regents Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University, and she will discuss US election outcome and its implications for global populism. And we might take one question for her from the audience for 5 minutes after her presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And thank you for allowing, I did arrange my schedule so I can stay the whole time. So we can just go on, you know, we can, we don't have to take questions if you don't want to, if you want to wait till the end, that's fine. I'm going to share my screen, and actually this, you know, we may overlap a little bit in our presentations because I know Alan Abramowitz is going to give a great analysis of the exit polls, I think. But I want to take kind of a bigger view of trying to understand what these election results mean. So from here, what happened, first of all? We know that there was a broad move to the right across the electorate, and this is a New York Times map that many of you may have seen with the little arrows showing where there was a move to the right, where there was, more of a vote for Republicans, and very few to the left. Right there in Georgia, where I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, you see some increase, some move to the left, but primarily it's a broad move to the right. But it's also an extremely close election. In fact, the closest since the 2001 Bush versus Gore decided by the Supreme Court. So this is, I think, important to look at, is really how close it is when we're interpreting what this means. And of course, that means that the society remains divided, at least in their partisan choice, but I'm going to argue in polarization as well. And you also see that part of what made it so close and led to Trump's victory is an increase in, on the right-hand side, an increase in the Republican vote and a decrease in the Democratic vote turnout. And we should note that there are still votes being counted, so we don't know for sure. Now, I want to ask this question: was it a mandate for change? Well, as Donald Trump is claiming, if you look at the statistics, and the part in the white will tell you how many total voters we have, how many total for each candidate. But what that means is, looking down at the yellow, really less than a third of Americans actively chose President Trump, and a slightly smaller number actively voted for Harris, about 1% roughly for third parties. So that means nearly 40% did not even participate. So we're talking about, a minority of voters making a choice, an active choice for President Trump. Now, there's a lot of comment about whether, a lot of commentary, analysis, thinking about how unusual is this election? Is this a temporary change toward a Republican majority in terms of a majority of the number of voters? Or is it a permanent change? So it is unusual in several aspects. First, it's only the second time in US history, the first was way back in the 19th century, that a president is non-consecutively reelected. So coming back in one time, lost, and then came back again to win again. That does happen in other countries. I've seen that a lot in Latin America, but it does not usually happen here. Of course, it's also unusual in that we have now elected a convicted felon who did try to subvert his prior election loss, and who was impeached twice in the House of Representatives, but not convicted in the Senate. And the question is this an ongoing party realignment? And I think we'll hear more from the next speakers on that question. But we do see more of an education and gender divide in this vote, less of an identity divide by racial and ethnic identity. So that's interesting, and will that continue? And we see the Republicans, the GOP, is kind of consolidating this conservative, I would call it a plutocratic populist party, following some other academics, because it definitely has the support of some of the richest people in the world, and its policies have been, under first Trump term, and I expect under the second one, particularly benefiting the richest segment of the US electorate in terms of the tax cuts for them, and that Trump wants to extend, but kind of presenting itself as a populist party, for the working class. And the Democrats really consolidating, the educated, kind of professional part of the electorate, and still pursuing more or less liberal, in this case, liberal the way it's used in the United States, which is more progressive, toward the left policies. So why did it happen? I think there are several different patterns evident. The first is this Financial Times analysis that was done, showing that there's this global anti-incumbent pattern, really this wave of Democratic discontent. And this is showing that when you look at way over to the right in 2024, it's the first time that all of the major elections in the developed countries, the major party lost vote share. It doesn't necessarily mean they lost the vote in every case, And if we look at, for example, Modi in India, he won the vote, but lost vote share. But in this case, in these cases, they all lost vote share. And so the US is part of a global wave. It's not unique. But there are more factors to consider. There's this general pattern in democracies that people vote, particularly get upset with inflation. And that was the case here. And the anti-immigrant reaction with big waves of reaction. So this is kind of following what we're seeing in other democracies as well. There's a relatively new pattern in the US that has been growing and was very evident this time, that I think plays a significant role, and that is our polarized information space, meaning that a significant part of the electorate are hearing repeated propaganda, repeated lies actually coming from the media sphere that they follow. The institutional setup of the United States also contributes to this. We have this rigid binary party system, two-party system, combined with the extent of polarization means those voters who just want change, they were upset with the current incumbent, had only one other choice. That was the Republican Party and Donald Trump. And then we have our ongoing sort of foundational divides in the United States: sexism, racism, religion, and sexual orientation divides. So do we know what Americans were actually voting for? I think that the biggest reason is going to be, and I expect we'll see some numbers coming up to show us this probably, but a change. I think the biggest reason is basically this change: an unpopular incumbent, and then his vice president trying to take over, and that cannot distance herself from him, and the inflation and immigration as two of the primary factors that made people want to change. There was probably some segment that were voting for an authoritarian style, a strong man, the macho bro style that was coming out, that they were really pushing, going after the young men, getting the influencers, the podcasters, and disruption. They wanted disruption. Then there's some segment that is just pure self-interest, primarily economic self-interest, primarily from the richer classes, but also some values voters who had particular values, moral values, religious values, especially around abortion, that they wanted to continue. And then there is the patriarchy. There is the continued, there's some segment, I have seen some analysts say maybe 20% of Americans, but I don't have evidence for this. But there's some analysis showing, they're just not going to vote for a woman. They just cannot see a woman as president of the country. So what does it mean for the US and for global democracy and stability? I see very high risks for US democracy. We know we will see an elimination of checks and balances, very likely. We already know the Senate will also be Republican. And we've had, President-elect Trump already requesting unprecedented power to erase the Senate's role to confirm his nominees for cabinet. He wants to do them through recess appointments, which allows him to put somebody in for up to almost 2 years without a confirmation process, without vetting, without a hearing. We expect that that the Republicans will win the House of Representatives. Some races are not called, but it's looking likely. And then we know he has a sympathetic Supreme Court. Second, accountability is already eliminated for Trump. He has escaped accountability. Most of the cases against him, the federal cases, will be dropped. And we know that he has immunity, almost carte blanche, a few, perhaps exceptions, but Supreme Court has granted immunity for the United States president while they're in office for any official acts that they take. I expect we will have to see how much he carries out his threat to weaken the rule of law, to politicize the Department of Justice, to use it to investigate his political opponents and his critics in the media. So this is a potential. His nominee, Matt Gaetz, for Attorney General, I would definitely try to carry this out. We don't know if he'll get confirmed. The potential corruption with the incorporation and support of billionaires, Elon Musk currently, going around with Trump, trying to influence the nominations, being given this undefined portfolio to cut government spending, doesn't mean he actually has any authority. He may not have any authority at all. He just may be outside the government making proposals. But the administration has definitely said they want a war on regulators. They want to take away the regulators which could allow regulations on government contracts, on vetting, on lots of things, which could allow more corruption. I expect we'll see unmet expectations because I expect the policies will benefit the plutocrats and not the working and middle class voters who voted for change and relief from the pressures and the economic pressures they're feeling. And I expect the dangers to continue, the dangers to women's health and lives from the current state control over reproductive rights, which means those who live in the Republican states who have very much restricted reproductive health care or eliminated it. Public health could be at threat if RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Is given a role over public health, which Trump has promised. He does not believe in vaccinations. We could see an outbreak of measles, polio, other removal of regulations over public safety issues, not only drugs, food, particularly energy. And then the risks for global policy and stability. Climate change will be set back. The United States will be moving away from that at the national level. We still do have states who will try, but at the national level, the recent recoveries in democratic erosion after this post-2005 autocratic wave that we have seen, I think the waves of recoveries that we've seen in Europe, in Brazil, and some other countries will probably be slowed. Populists and autocrats around the world will be emboldened, and multilateralism is at risk. The U.S., Trump, is not in favor of multilateral organizations. The U.S. role as global lender and provider of security is likely to decline. And then inflation and trade wars from the tariff policy if he carries it out. But he certainly seems very strong on that. So finally, is there any good news? Well, maybe. I think it may be that we're in this interregnum period in looking at kind of world orders. We've moved from the neoliberalism that we saw in the 1980s, the 1990s, going in the 2000s, to this new, still undefined one. What is taking over, where we've seen a rise of populism. We've seen the major role and the alliance of authoritarian countries, Russia, China, Iran, others, filling the vacuum for now. And we don't yet know where it's going to go. Crisis brings opportunity for reform and progress. And in the United States, I expect we'll see both disruption. Trump would like to really remake the government institutions. So we'll see disruption in that. But it also brings an opportunity, if it's chaotic, for reform and progress, for reform movement. And I think for long overdue institutional change needed in the United States. Trump could moderate. We don't know. He's unpredictable. Some people think, his unpredictability could actually help resolve or deter global wars and hotspots. He will continue what he began, and Biden has continued the anti-China policy, seeing that as a major threat to the United States, and this protectionist America First policy. It provides in the United States an opportunity for party realignment and strengthening, which is needed. I would like to see the institutional change up in number 2 to lead us to the possibility of a more multi-party system, but at least the parties need to be strengthened. And in the world, we'll see more of a multipolar world. And the question will be, it's an opportunity for Europe, Latin America, the
Hello? I can't hear audio.
I believe Dr. McCoy froze.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but you're back now. Fantastic.
Oh no, did you see me finish?
No, it's not.
How far could you see me? Oh,
You were talking about good news.
We just missed the very end, just the last few.
that was my last slide, the good news slide.
Okay.
Okay, that was the last slide. So sorry.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dr. McCoy. So now we're going to Dr. Alan Abramowitz for his presentation. And his topic is, it was mostly the economy is stupid, and he's gonna explain Trump's victory for us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, I thought that was a terrific presentation, Jennifer, which is not surprising. That's exactly what I would expected from Jennifer. And I'm going to actually reiterate a lot of the points that she just made in my presentation, which will be fairly brief. So it's now been just over 1 week since the US presidential election, but enough time, I think, to have see a few clear patterns in the election here. The first thing that I want to talk about here on this first slide, and this is again following up on something that Jennifer was saying, that I think the single most important factor in explaining the outcome of this election was simply the fact that we had an incumbent president, although he was not on the ballot, who was extremely unpopular. According to the data from the the national exit poll, Biden's approval rating stood at 39%, with a disapproval rating of 59%. So that translates into a net disapproval of, or net approval rating of -20. So Joe Biden was deeply underwater, and he had been for quite some time. And when we look across the spectrum of US presidential elections from 1952 through 2024, unfortunately, we don't have the data for 1948 from the time of the election, but if we look at the relationship between the president's approval rating and the vote for the incumbent party, regardless of whether the president was running for re-election, we can see that there's a fairly strong relationship here. It's not perfect, but the main generalization that we can take away from this is that when a party is seeking the presidency with an incumbent whose approval rating is underwater, meaning a net approval below 0, they always lose. As you see this pattern here, you can see 2024 is actually above the line, meaning that Kamala Harris actually did better than you would have expected just based on the fact that Joe Biden's approval rating was so far underwater. But she faced a very, very difficult political environment, given the fact that Biden's approval rating was so far underwater. The factors that contributed to his approval being so low, I think, have been discussed by Jennifer. Certainly, economic conditions had a lot to do with this, and we've seen the same pattern, across many countries. The high rates of inflation that we had post-pandemic, And although the US economy has recovered very well, and we've seen inflation come way down, unemployment has remained low, job creation strong, real wages coming back now. But overall, across the entire 4 years of the Biden presidency, we have a very high inflation. And this is what voters seem to be perceiving. Even though the rate of inflation now is low, voters are unhappy about the fact that they're paying a lot more now for basic goods and services than they were 4 years ago. And they're unhappy about that. And they're taking that out on the party of the incumbent president. Misinformation and disinformation may have something to do with these perceptions. Certainly, there's a big partisan divide in voters' perceptions of economic conditions, as there is, of course, in evaluations of the president. But it really transcends the partisan divide. Even among Democrats, Joe Biden's approval rating at the time of the election was only around 77%. That's not good at all for an incumbent's approval rating from his own party. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So this just shows the overall trend here. What happens when you have an incumbent with a net negative or net positive approval rating? We have 19 elections since World War II that we have data for. And you can see, again, as I already mentioned, that when the incumbent president's approval rating is negative 7 times, including 2024, the candidate of the incumbent party has lost every time. A positive approval rating doesn't guarantee re-election. There are other factors that come into play, but it seems to be a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for the party of the incumbent president to win re-election. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So when we look at the data from the national exit poll, we can see that, looking on the left side there, Joe Biden had a 39% approval rating, 15%, only 15% strongly approved, and 24% somewhat approved. So those who approved of Biden's job performance voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. 98% of those strongly approved, 95% of those who only somewhat approved. And even among the 14% who somewhat disapproved of Biden, a majority actually voted for Kamala Harris. The problem for her and for the Democrats in general is that 45% of the electorate strongly disapproved of Biden's performance. Now, some of this is partisanship, but it clearly goes beyond that. So among that group that group voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And you put that all together, and it meant that Harris was really fighting very, very strong headwinds in her efforts to overcome Joe Biden's unpopularity. Okay, we can move on. The other point that's important to mention, and I think we heard about this in the introduction, and it's something that should be stressed here. I think Jennifer also talked about this. Despite those headwinds, despite Joe Biden's unpopularity, despite the economic problems that were being experienced by many Americans, this was a very close election. We don't have the final numbers yet, but the projections I've seen are that once all the votes are counted, and most of the votes that are still uncounted are in California. There are some in other places as well. But it's expected that Trump will win the national popular vote by a margin of between 1 and 2 percentage points. That makes it the closest presidential election since 2000, and one of the 4 closest presidential elections in the entire post-World War II era. So the electoral vote makes it look like the outcome was a lot more decisive than it really was. And that's because Trump did win all of the swing states, but he won most of them by very narrow margins. And that's what often happens in these close elections. Usually, the candidate who wins the national popular vote wins most of the swing states by close margins. That did not happen in 2016, when Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote by 2 percentage points, but lost most of the swing states. But in this election, the swing states and the nation sort of moved in the same direction. In fact, the swing states moved less than the nation did. So it's important to keep in mind that this was a close election, and most of our recent presidential elections, indeed most of our recent national elections, elections for the House, elections for the Senate, all the way up and down the ballot, have been close. All these elections reflect the underlying reality of a very closely divided American electorate, where the outcomes are determined by very small swings in one direction or the other. Okay, we can move on. The other thing that really stands out to me when I look at the results of the election was the incredible degree of consistency in the results over time. So here we see a scatter plot that shows the relationship between the Democratic presidential vote margin in 2020 at the state level and the Democratic presidential vote margin in 2024. Subject to some minor change because, again, there are still some votes being counted. And believe it or not, I think the relationship will be even slightly stronger once all the votes have been counted. But obviously, it won't change very much. And obviously, you can see there that one can almost perfectly predict the 2024 vote from the 2020 vote. The difference being, of course, that there was a pretty consistent decline in the support for the Democratic presidential candidate between the two elections. Now, it was slightly bigger in some states than others. It's not, it doesn't explain 100% of the variance. There are some other factors that actually contribute to explaining the outcome in addition to the vote in 2020. For example, if you plug into this to a regression equation, a variable measuring the Hispanic percentage of the population in a state, that has a significant negative effect over and above the vote in the previous election. So with this, where we saw Kamala Harris losing support, or Democrats losing support among Latino voters compared with 2020. On the other hand, if you put in a dummy variable for the 7 swing states, what you find is that Harris actually did better in the swing states, that the swing was smaller. There was still a swing, of course, toward Trump, but it was smaller in the swing states, suggesting perhaps that Harris's campaign was effective, at least in minimizing the shift or the anti-democratic movement in the states where there was the most intensive campaigning. Okay, we can move on then. This pattern of consistency extends well beyond these 2 elections, by the way. So this is just a correlation matrix showing the correlations among the Democratic vote margin at the state level across the last 5 presidential elections. And you can see that there's a tremendous degree of consistency even between 2008 and 2024. The outcomes were very different. In 2008, of course, Barack Obama won a decisive victory, winning by a margin of over 7%. But I'm sorry, let's go back to that previous one. 2024, Democrats losing by a margin of between 1% and 2%. But the correlation at the state level is 0.93. You can see, of course, the correlations are stronger between the two Obama era elections, 2008 and 12, and then we have the 3 Trump era, like if you want to call it the Trump era, 2016, 20, and 24. Those are very, very highly correlated. So there's some change here depending on the particular candidates who are running and the national political environment. But overall, a high degree of consistency, and that's reflected as well. We can see that at the county level. We can see that at the congressional district level. We can see that just on any geographic unit you can obtain data for. We see this tremendous degree of consistency, much greater than in the past. So if you go back to for example, the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, there was much less consistency between election results over time. The correlations would be much weaker. We'd see much bigger swings. Voters were not as tied to their parties. So this is a reflection of this growing partisan polarization that we see in the United States, meaning that we have less movement over time, fewer voters shifting, strong straight ticket voting down the ballot. All of these things reflect this underlying polarization. Okay, we can move on now. So what changed? The evidence suggests so far, and I think Jennifer also alluded to this, that this was largely a turnout election, that most of the change, certainly not all of it, but most of the change that occurred between 2020 and 2024 reflected changes in voter turnout. It was who showed up. it was less about actual vote switching. If we look at in terms of vote switching, based on according to the national exit poll, among those who voted in both elections, only 6% of Biden voters moved to Trump in 2024 versus 4% of Trump voters who moved to Harris. So very little shifting there. The overwhelming majority stayed with the same party. A slight gain for Trump coming out of that, but that not nearly enough to explain the overall net swing in the outcome, going from a 4.5-point Democratic margin in 2020 to a 1.5 point, roughly, Republican margin in 2024. So most of that swing over time, most of that shift must have reflected other things, and primarily turnout. Overall voter turnout appears to have declined modestly from 2020, when it was about 68%. It looks like it's going to be about 64%, 65% in this election. That's still very high by US standards. Keep in mind that turnout in US elections, of course, is very low by international standards. But for an American presidential election, 2020 was a record. It was the highest turnout in many, many, many years, the highest in the entire post-World War II era. 2024 will be a little bit lower, but still a relatively high turnout. But the change in turnout was not equal across the board. What we see here is that Democratic turnout fell sharply in many strongly Democratic counties and cities. The actual number of votes for the Democratic candidate was much lower in places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, pretty much across the board, while Republican votes stayed the same or increased modestly. So, this suggests that there was a turnout factor here, and that Democrats were hurt by the fact that they were not able to mobilize parts of their electorate. And the Republicans were more successful in mobilizing their electorate. And it will remain to be investigated, I think, once we have good survey data, for example, data from the American National Election Studies, to try to understand what was really going on here. But the result of these shifts in turnout is that the partisan composition of the national electorate shifted from +1 Democratic in 2020, meaning Democratic identification minus Republican identification, to +4 Republican in 2024. And that +4 Republican Party ID advantage in the national electorate, according to the national exit poll, it's one of the largest, that we've seen in recent elections. The divide has been very close in recent elections, but that 5-point swing in margin is enough by itself to account for almost all of the shift in the election results at the national level. And I suspect we'll see the same thing when we look at the state level. All right, now we can move on. So looking beyond 2024, based on what happened this year, what can we expect in the future? We have a midterm election coming up in 2 years. Now, I know, given who's in the White House right now and some of the threats he's issued, and the way he's talked about trying to subvert the threat to subvert democracy, we're making an assumption here that there will be a midterm election in 2 years, and there will be another presidential election in 4 years. I'm pretty confident that there will be, but we shouldn't underestimate the threat, as Jennifer was suggesting, the threat that Donald Trump potentially poses to American democracy. But we know what happens in midterm elections. The out party almost always makes gains in midterm elections, even after disastrous presidential elections. We can look at elections like 1958 for the Democrats, 1966 for Republicans, 1986 for Democrats, 2006 for the Democrats, 2010 for Republicans, 2018 for Democrats. Midterm elections that followed severe setbacks in a presidential election, and all of those midterm elections only 2 years later resulted in significant gains for the party, for the out party. I believe Democrats are likely to make gains. In fact, they're almost certain to make gains in 2026. And they could bounce back and have a very strong election in 2026. A lot will depend, or at least some of it will depend, on how voters assess the performance of President Trump and his administration. and the Republicans who will be in charge of the entire Congress over the next 2 years. But Trump was quite unpopular during his first term. And based on what we're seeing now, and based on the fact that even in winning the election, more voters rated him unfavorably than favorably, quite remarkable, in the national exit poll, there's little reason to think, I think, that Trump will be much more popular in his second term in the White House. In fact, he could be less popular. Democrats have a great chance, I think, will very likely to win back the House of Representatives in 2 years. They'll probably make significant gains at the state level. The Senate presents a significant obstacle to Democrats, however, just given the makeup of the Senate, the fact that states, regardless of population, have 2 senators. That means the Senate overall tilts somewhat to the right. And if you look at the states coming up in 2026, there will be some Democratic pickup opportunities, but it's going to be difficult for them to gain, at least 4 seats that they'll probably need to win back the Senate. What about 2028? That's a long way off, obviously, and there's not a lot we can say at this point about we don't know what the political environment will look like. We do know, however, that Donald Trump will, if he's still in office, and we don't know if he will still be around in 4 years, but if he is, he'll be 82 years old. He's likely to be unpopular. He's consistently been unpopular. In his first term, he almost never, if ever, I think, got his approval rating above 50%. So, Democrats should have a decent chance to win back the White House in 4 years. They won't have the baggage of an unpopular incumbent president in the White House. Indeed, the Republican nominee, whoever that is, might conceivably, be faced with that kind of, have to run with that kind of baggage. But that remains to be seen, of course. I will make one quick prediction, however, if you move on to the next slide. My scenario for 2028 is that we'll be seeing an election featuring Chelsea Clinton versus Ivanka Trump. So that's my prediction, and you can write that down and remind me of it in 4 years.
Dr. Abramowitz, could you please wrap up?
That's it.
That's it? Perfect. Well, after those...
I want to leave you with that important prediction.
Thank you. After 2 excellent presentations, now we're going to Dr. Marcia Pelli. She's a professor at New York University, and she's going to discuss the role of white evangelicals in the 2024 US presidential election and what we know so far. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to everybody who made it possible for me to join you today and share some of my ideas. Thanks also to the 2 previous presenters who gave an excellent overview of what's happening right now. I'm going to make a few quick introductory remarks and then plunge into my presentation to look at sort of what's behind the information that you got from the first spectacular presentations. So my introductory remarks are as follows. We do see, as has been noted, that this across the globe is a time of incumbent losses, and that is true for the movement to the right and movement to the left. Poland threw out their right-wing government, the UK threw out their conservative government and moved to the left. Many countries have an anti-incumbent moving to the right, as what we see in the United States. Secondly, I think it is worth saying over and over again how small the margin is, and I thank my previous presenters for making that very, very clear, which means that we may get large policy shifts domestically and internationally, owing to a very small shift in less than 1/3 of the US population. And I think that's worth noting. That has to do, of course, with our 2-party system. In terms of the policy shifts, I think we have to be very clear to distinguish between the rhetoric and promises on the campaign, which may have attracted a larger or large enough base for Trump, and the actual policies that would be put into place, and to look at whom those policies would actually benefit: upper income large corporations or ordinary middle and working class voters. Jennifer made this point, and I'm going about the composition of the Republican Party or the center right in the United States. And I'm going to say it this way, and Jennifer, you'll hear the echo to your presentation. The center all the way to the right in the United States is comprised of either the wealthy upper income earners or corporations who are making a rational, if self-interested, choice for economic financial benefit. That's one component. The second component is the well-known base, middle, and working class voters who believe that the policies of the Republican Party will benefit them. And that's 2, but there's a 2.5. There's the 0.5, and the 0.5 is the religious right that belong either to one or two, either to the wealthy upper income earners or to the base. So that leaves us with our religious right-wing voters. And I'm going to focus especially on white evangelicals because of their impact on the vote. But I think we should also say that American evangelicals, and this is my final introductory note, American evangelicals are Americans. And much that influences them is exactly the same as influencing the rest of the American population. And so I'm going to plunge into that now. I see this vote, including the vote of white evangelicals, as a right-wing populist vote. And I'm going to understand populism with this minimal definition as a way of responding to duress. You can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. As a way of responding to duress. One second, I'm having a tiny bit of technical difficulty. There we go. A way of responding to duress as experienced by the person who is feeling it. 2, it's a way of responding that finds solution in strong us-them frameworks. And 3, that identifies us and them, drawing from historical and cultural notions of society, who's in and who's not in, and government, its proper size and role. So we'll keep this minimal definition in mind as I talk a little bit about the background of America and then American evangelicals as a subset of America. So we're keeping in mind duress, us-them shift, through this background of historical and cultural resources. So first, the duresses can be economic, that you know a good deal about. The pressures since the 1980s on the costs of housing, healthcare, daycare, education, and elder care, and the losses in that purchasing power, especially in old industry regions, prodded at this point mostly by automation and productivity gains. But the duress, our first component in our populist rubric, the duress may not be only economic. Way of life duress is very important and includes shifts in technology, gender roles, demographics, and I will repeat technology because of its impact on productivity and automation, jobs, and wages. And a third component of duress is status loss. Fear, the actual loss of one's place in society, or fear of losing one's respectable place that one knows oneself and feels comfortable and respected in. And this provokes a desire to restore the rightful order of things where one felt one had one's place and was respected. Altogether, economic way of life and status loss have yielded the sense for Americans and white evangelicals that life is less easy, less familiar, and less fair than a generation ago. And that living conditions are determined by those who care little about one's circumstances and whom one cannot reach or influence through the regular governance processes. I think we can go to the next slide now. Thank you very much. In addition to these general American stressors, pressures bearing specifically on white evangelicals include membership loss and a growing sense of cultural and political marginalization in an increasingly secular, multicultural, and socially liberal country. White evangelicals have decreased as a share of the population from about 23% in 2006 to 14% in 2020. The median age of white evangelicals is 56, making it the most aged group in aged religious group in the United States. Robert Jones, my friend and colleague at the Public Religion Research Institute, has noted the real visceral sense of loss of cultural dominance has set in among white evangelicals. Now, this current loss of cultural dominance has been aggravated by more than a century of diminishing white evangelical sway in the public sphere. We can think of the late 19th century changes in industrialization, urbanization, Darwinism, the liberalizing of social norms. And in the 20th century, the white evangelicals lost the war up until now on teaching evolution in the public schools. They lost the fight to have school-run prayer. And there have been sweeping changes in the roles of racial, religious, and sexual minorities since the 1960s. A sense of the loss of cultural dominance can be sensed that by 2021, 70% of Americans and 55% of Republicans supported the legality of same-sex marriage, increasing evangelical fears of a drubbing by a secular state and multicultural liberal society. We can also get a sense of this fear of a drubbing from our current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who said in a recent podcast that, quote, "What we have found was often the Christian viewpoint is not given equal treatment and equal platform and equal chance. Very often religious viewpoints, specifically Christian viewpoints, are censored and silenced." So we've looked at the duresses experienced by many Americans, economic way of life and status. We've looked at some duresses by white evangelicals in particular, adding on top of the duresses experienced as Americans. So let's move to the us-them response to duress. This is a completely normal human response to threat and loss. When duress accumulates and persists, it is a common psychological move to separate me from you or us from them, the ostensible source of duress, in hopes of forestalling further harm from them, the thems, ostensibly the source of duress. Let's try the next slide. Yeah, great. So under attack or loss or threat, the usual focus on one's own groups shifts outward to a move to constrain an other thought to be the source of duress. And we can see this in an analysis of 800 elections in 20 democracies from the 1870s till about 2014 that found that financial crises and other forms of duress put a strain on democracies, and far-right parties see strong political gains. In the last 30 years or so, we have seen that left-wing populism can also see a gain as a response to duress. Vamek Volkan is a psychiatrist who specializes in extremist groups, and he writes, quote, "The more stressful the situation, the more neighbor groups become preoccupied with each other, that outward shift towards the them ostensibly causing the duress. But which neighbor groups to be preoccupied with? Ideas about who is causing the duress, the thems, have to be understandable to the populace. And while new proposals for thems are not precluded from understandability, the most usual draw from the familiar, from society's traditional ideas of the other, specifically the other about society, who's in, who's not, and about government, its proper size and role." Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So I'm going to very quickly give an idea of the background pool of ideas for that current populism draws from, and then specifically for white evangelicals. The earliest notions come from Reformed covenantal political theory brought to the colonies by the Puritans and others dissenting from Europe's state churches. Following the Hebrew Bible, they understood the polity as a covenant with God and among persons, and sovereignty as residing in the people. Really one of the earliest formulations of something like representative democracy. A ruler who violates this covenant with the governed may be legitimately removed from office, an idea articulated more than a century before our Declaration of Independence. And as covenantalists, they were also persecuted by Europe's state churches. So both from a theological, political theory and historical persecution, covenantalists are very wary of government, elite authorities, and others, outsiders, who may disturb their way of life. We should note that the 1620 Mayflower Compact sought to establish not only a covenantal government in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but also control over non-Puritan outsiders. A second background resource for American populism is Aristotelian republicanism, which also emphasizes the community, the polis, and citizen participation in running it. It too is wary of authorities who are prone to becoming tyrants. A third background resource is liberalism, which puts less stress on community and more on individual freedom, but was equally wary of potentially constraining authorities on elites and elites. So we had a triple-sourced wariness of government and outsiders here. And this was especially persuasive in America, precisely because many immigrants were fleeing oppressive political, economic, and religious systems. Moreover, the harsh frontier, which lasted till the early 20th century, further advised self-reliance, trust in one's local community, and wariness of distant authorities and elite experts who understood little of local life. We can see this from the very earliest parts of our foundation of our country. We can see it, for example, in the very early Shays and Whiskey rebellions that erupted almost as soon as the country was formed against what? Against government, regulation, and taxation. There is your anti-government animus in early formation. We also see that the law that Trump is now considering using as a justification for mass deportations comes from 1798. It is a portion of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is an early expression of suspicion of the outsider. We can go through more of the history in the Q&A, if you like, of this double wariness of government and elites and outsiders, which in America has usually been new immigrants and minorities. Now to white evangelicals specifically, and we can go to the next slide, please.
Dr. Pally, could you please wrap up?
Yeah, I'm going to take one comment on white evangelicals, one comment on the and the result. So white evangelicals, there we go. I want to focus on the last doctrinal principles that, in addition to everything just said, they have two doctrinal principles, the fallenness of human government and personal responsibility to come to truth. And therefore, again, an emphasis on the individual working out on how to witness God's vision, and a belief that that also encouraged wariness of authorities and outsiders. Can you go to the next slide? What we have for white evangelicals, therefore, is a twofold source of duress that we just described, the economic and way of life that felt by many Americans, plus religio-cultural loss of dominance, and a twofold source of government and outsider wariness. Can you go to the next slide? This is what happens in society under duress. In America, commitment to building community, which is a very positive and robust form of life in America, may become self-protective, my community in struggle against outsiders. And of course, the second, wariness of oppressive government and elites may become suspicion of big government and elites per se. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And here we come to the bottom line irony for the white evangelical vote, which is strongly for the Republican Party. The very anti-authoritarianism and community building that contributed much to American vibrancy and are bequeathed to evangelicals by history and doctrine as the ethical life may, under duress and distress, turn to protective us-them worldviews and practices. Can you go to the next slide? We'll take the abortion question at the Q&A. And I'd like to wrap up with this thought. We see on one hand a polarized society, but on the other hand, I also see that Trump has tapped in to very, very long-standing animus and suspicion of government and outsiders. Both sides, quote unquote, and this is my summation, in the current political polarization have the same diagnosis for what has gone awry: breach of the basic democratic political covenant. On one hand, looking at the right wing, some see racist, xenophobic, sexist, and homophobic attacks on the bonds among all in the republic. But those on the populist right may say, where are your bonds and people's sovereignty when it comes to us? They too believe that the basic societal covenant has been broken, leaving them vulnerable to resource losses, unfair economic and living conditions, and to a hostile secular government and to a dismissive liberal society. They too feel that their democratic compact has been hijacked by outsider wokeness. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pally, for this wonderful presentation. Now we're going to Dr. Mabel Berezin, and she is a distinguished professor of arts and sciences in sociology and director of the Institute of European Studies at Cornell University. And the topic is, does Trumpism cross the Atlantic?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Okay, I'm not going to use PowerPoints. And I brought one PowerPoint that was a a photo that I took and that I have decided not to show, and I'll explain why at the end. Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to discuss with my distinguished colleagues this very important, obviously important issue. And when the panel was originally conceived, we did not know, as far as I remember, because it was conceived before the election, what the result would be. And I've been thinking that my comments would be different depending upon the outcome, obviously. And I've also been thinking that on many of the issues, it's too soon to tell. And that's something that I rarely think about when I do a presentation. I want to thank many of the colleagues who came before me because many of the presentations were excellent, and they do define a lot of the moments from the past campaign and from what happened, and I'll be using some of the issues that they brought up. What I'm going to try to do is quickly describe what I see as the trajectory of anti-democratic right nationalist trends, mainly in Europe, which is where I work. And then I want to identify what I consider two dangerous pulse points in the American case that there aren't really comparables for in the European case. And then I'll talk briefly, very briefly, about the future. So first, let me start with the global trend. And it's undeniable that there is a global anti-democratic, democratic backsliding. Multiple terms have been used for this. And there is a similarity to that in this kind of rejection of democracy, or at least questioning of it. But there are, of course, national specificities, and it is in the national specificities are important. So what I would like to try to do is point out in the second part of my talk, what are the ways that America is different? Europe, of course, is what I know, but I would say Latin America is probably might be more comparable to what's going on in the United States today. So my method is always historical. I look at events and I try to map the trajectory of events. So let me briefly do a trajectory of what I see has been going on, at least in Europe, in the last 20 plus years. There's arguably a trend, a move to the right. It began, it was always there. There were always right-wing parties in Europe. But movement began, I would in the late 1990s with a series of elections in France, and remained more or less stable, these parties, and at the margins, until what I identify as the triple crisis of 2015. And the triple crisis is began with the terror events in Paris, the debt crisis in Greece, and then, of course, the refugee crisis. And that's where I identify acceleration. And this is before Trump and Brexit, although it was Trump and Brexit that pushed everybody over the edge to suddenly become interested in these parties. And after 2015, you see an upward trajectory in elections, and unlikely places such as Sweden and now Germany are suddenly having right-wing parties that have a place in governance, actually. And how I have explained this in my writings and in talks I've given is that what has happened is a security crisis. And it's basically that stability in multiple realms, political, social, economic, cultural, that have been shattered in various ways. And that it is this lack of security, the writ large, that has actually sort of pushed these movements forward. And this is more than simply an economic crisis, although economics is important. The issue of neoliberalism is a constant theme in this. But there's also the cultural issue of who are the globalists and who are the nationalists, and who are the people that have to remain in one place and who are those people who move. Now there is a famous, there's a cover that I've seen over and over again. I'm sure those of you who work on populism have seen this. It's a 2017 cover from the Economist that has a picture of Trump, Le Pen, and Putin on it. And it has been the cover of at least one academic book, Pippa Norris and Ronald Englehart's cultural background, book called Cultural Backlash, sorry. And I think I've always sort of argued that that cover didn't quite get it. I mean, it may get it now with Putin and Trump, but it didn't get it with Marine Le Pen. And I've always argued that comparisons are wrong when we try to go across the Atlantic. And the very first article I ever wrote on this was Trump is not a European-style populist, and that is our problem. And what I meant was that basically European populists who have been doing quite well of the Marine Le Pen variety, are basically interested in going backwards. Their moves are predictable. They want to return to the security of the post-war years, and they basically want more government, not less. I mean, if you had to characterize that in comparison to the United States. And that as far as the populists from the center of Europe, people like Le Pen and Meloni now, et cetera, they basically don't need Donald Trump. They've been doing quite well without him. They don't need a regime like this in the United States. Basically, they have some similarities. They're concerned about immigration, obviously. The Great Replacement is a theme both in the United States and in Europe. But they also have some safeguards that we don't have, and that somebody has just mentioned, the multi-party system. So you don't really succumb to like one leader in the way we do with the dual party system. So obviously when the election came along, they all congratulated Trump, more or less. The people that he's most comparable to, well, Putin I'll put in another category. I don't know if there are any Russian experts here, but Orban is his closest, in the sense that Orban is trying and has been very successful at rewriting the Hungarian constitution. But in general, aside from those people, those leaders from regimes from countries that were non-democratic until after 1989, the similarities are really not as compelling as the sort of label of right-wing populism would assume. And this is why I want to get to what I call the dangerous pulse points in the American situation. Which really haven't quite been alluded to. They've been sort of alluded to, but not highlighted in the presentation so far. And I would argue that there were dangers in the United States. There would have been dangers even if Harris had won. And as many as all of you have pointed out, the election is really close. So it wasn't a mandate in any way, shape, or form, although Trump is talking about it as though it were a mandate, as we'd sort of expect him to do. But I've never actually believed or seen evidence that Trump has his own special Trumpian agenda, okay? And he certainly is bad news. He doesn't believe in democracy. But he doesn't have a fully fleshed theory or a fully fleshed agenda on his own. Now, he's obviously instrumental and will obviously do just about anything. I mean, that's what all of you have mentioned that at some point, how erratic he is. But I've never seen him as having a personal master plan, at least a personal master plan about politics. He certainly has a master plan about benefiting himself and his family and corruption and things like that. But what I've always been concerned about was people around him who might have a master plan. And there are three areas that I have concern with and that don't particularly have exact equivalents in at least the European context. And the first is what I call institutions and intellectuals. That is people who are smarter than he is, who actually have global visions, global meaning global visions of how to redo the Constitution. And people with those visions who might have who advocate what I would call a form of social authoritarianism, meaning a very traditionalist view of gender roles and household roles and birthing roles and things like that. You see a little bit of this. Well, you do see some of it in European countries. Italy comes to mind immediately. You see judicial realignment, which I mentioned, Hungary. So it's institutions and intellectuals, judicial realignment. And then the third thing that actually hasn't been mentioned is empowerment of paramilitary groups. And this also doesn't quite have a European counterpart. There is a wonderful book that has just come out called Living Right by a sociologist, Agnieszka Pesika. It's going to come out of Princeton University Press. And what it's about is camps in Poland and Italy that actually train youth, the sort of, a reinvigoration of the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. I don't even know if they still exist in the US because I don't have any kids and I don't participate in such things. But at any rate, so those are the three things I want to talk about in a little bit more detail here. First of all, and I think this is probably more American than European, the Trump years, so this is danger one that would have been there even if he hadn't won. The Trump years have given legitimacy to paramilitary groups who have long resided in the interstices of non-institutionalized politics. These groups have found their leader in Trump and Trumpism. And that was the picture I wanted to put up, but I don't want to put these, I decided not to put these things up because nothing goes away from YouTube, even if you canceled me out. And I did some door knocking in the sort of northeast corner of Pennsylvania, which is closest to Ithaca, which is where I live when I'm teaching. And it is probably the poorest area that I've ever walked around. And when we were walking around the list of houses that we had at our, that we were supposed to knock on doors, there wasn't even like a coffee shop. We were looking for something, but there was a shop with guns and ammunition with a big sign and that put the guns in a way that it looked like a Nazi sign. And I also got the feeling that people were genuinely afraid when we knocked on the doors. And it's what I'm bringing this up because I do think it actually, guns and fear that you could see on the ground. And I've seen this a lot just driving through Pennsylvania, is something that we don't think about because it's so far removed from what most of us deal with every day. Recently, these groups have been under the radar of academics and journalists, although they have been around for a while. The historian Kathleen Belew has an excellent book about how many of these groups came together in the post-Vietnam War years and people who were trained in the military. They show up in Charlottesville. This is the Stand Back and Stand By group. They show up on January 6th. Proud Boys are one iteration, but they are not alone, and the American gun culture makes them potentially lethal. There is a recent documentary called Against All Enemies, which is terrifying in this regard, as it shows how right-wing groups, these are not the people that are sort of out necessarily campaigning for Trump, but they are certainly voting for Trump if they vote. But these right-wing groups recruit veterans to train with guns of all sorts to be on constant guard against, not clear who, but if you listen to the film, people are talking about they have to be prepared against the enemy. So that is one thing. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. We saw it on January 6th, but it's there. It's much more salient than it was. And certainly Trump gives support to that, just the fact of his existence. The second thing is what I call the institutional side. I feel is almost more dangerous than the gun toters, because they use the law to limit fundamental freedoms, or at least that's their goal. And we have only to think of the Supreme Court, the abortion ruling, the presidential immunity ruling. Trump has proved extremely useful to this, so I call it intellectual brigade that uses the law as weapons. And they are more dangerous because they are more difficult to pull apart than paramilitary groups. You can put a person in jail for opening fire with an AR-15 rifle, not so easy with a person whose main weapon is a thesaurus. Project 2025 is the Bible of this group. And again, you have the Heritage Foundation as its home, but it's not its only home. The Federalist Society, the Conservative Political Action Conference, the National Conservatism Group, they're all part of this cadre. They are focused, and their plan is to dismantle the deep state as we know it by picking apart agencies and institutions. And it was already said in one of the talks that regulation is one of the things that people don't like who vote for Trump, okay? These groups, also have a social dimension that they are deeply fixated on the idea that they cannot be any meaningful communities outside of traditional family structures. Masculinity is one of their major cultural tropes. And I know we just saw a picture of Chelsea Clinton, Ivanka Trump, but I can actually more easily see J.D. Vance in 2028 than those two. Now this would require—
Dr. Berezin, could you please wrap up?
Okay, I just have one thing left to say, and that is the future. All right, so I don't see this in Europe, and as I said, we'd have to look at other parts of the world, or I don't see it exactly the way I've described it. What is the future? Again, as I said, it's not a mandate, but I do think we have to be concerned about the fact that there are the guardrails are weak, at least with Trump as president. The appointments he made in the last 2 days for those things international are more than troubling. So as one looks to Europe, again, where I would be looking, one just sees, difficulties. Think of the Ukraine, think of Gaza. It's not a good scenario. International NATO, international institutions, it cannot be other than they are threatened. But again, there is a question in my mind, even after listening to the other talks here, is to what extent can any of this be actually carried out, some of the things that Trump proposes. So let me just close with a quote from what Marine Le Pen, what she had to say after the election of Trump. And I think it's probably where the direction in Europe, right-wing, center, non-right-wing will be. The only thing, and this is from Le Pen, the only thing I think about is the interest of France. Now that the United States will defend its interests more vigorously, Europe must wake up and defend its own. So I think that's where we're going, at least with Trump as president. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berezin, for this excellent presentation. Now we're going to Dr. Marina North. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the V-Dem Institute, University of Gothenburg. And her topic of discussion is the return of Trump and the future of global democracy.
Yeah. Sorry. Can you see the slides now? Does it work?
Yes, we can use your slide.
Thank you.
See your
Thank
slide.
you for the confirmation. Yeah. So thank you for inviting me, and much has been said, but since I come from the V-Dem Institute, I will of course talk with data and talk with facts. So first, let me show you where we are in terms of democracy in the US today. So this slide shows you the average development of the liberal democracy index for the world, for the Western Europe and North America average, and then the United States compared. And I have zoomed in this trajectory, and you see with the red line what is shown is the previous Trump presidency. So you see that this is the last 50 years, and for quite some time, the US trajectory was above the average for Western Europe and North America. And then we are now below. We have slightly hit it with the last presidency of Biden. But just to give you a perspective, by the end of the last Trump presidency, we were back to 1975. So that was shortly right after the time that we had the Watergate scandal. And then you see that for most period of the time, the US was above the average for Western Europe and North America for liberal democracies. And we are now below that. And there was only one exception. That was the early ages of Bush presidency and right after the 9/11. So what has been happening with the US democratic accountability? Again, this is compared to several countries. You see with this trend that democratic accountability in the US has been declining since approximately 2016. So that's again the last Trump presidency. This compared to Western countries, Western Europe on average, and then compared to countries that have been autocratizing during the last 10, 15 years. This is Poland, Hungary, Turkey. So you see also we are losing, accountability is gradually eliminated. And then again, what you see is that accountability that was destroyed during the Trump presidency has not really recovered much during Biden presidency. Then the next thing that I wanted to show is that I tried, and we have in V-Dem over 600 indicators that measure different aspects of democracy. So what I did, I just went and identified, wrote the script that identified the 10 indicators that declined the most in terms of magnitude of change and growth and statistically significant. And you see that the top of the list is deliberative components. So these are indicators that goes to deliberation. So the process by which decisions are reached in the society. So whether they are reached by long and careful after a long and careful discussion and public reasoning focused on a common good, or whether they are just made in a moment. And this is what Trump was doing during his presidency for quite some time. He has this tendency to make policy in the moment without, sometimes even within a span of the conversation, and then people around him just try to make sense of what he has just said. So I think this is just to keep in mind. And then the second thing that you see here is that electoral integrity index, so this is clean elections, and the component that is driving the decline in the US is electoral violence. And we in V-Dem Institute, right before the elections, we were discussing for quite some time what would happen if Trump had lost elections, right? I mean, so if Trump loses elections, we were very much afraid that it would come eventually to electoral violence. Again, just to show you, this is deliberative component in electoral integrity, two indicators, the one that I picked up just to show you the trend during the last 10 years. And you see that much of the decline happened during the Trump presidency, and then during Biden presidency, it hasn't recovered much. So we are still there. And then again, Jennifer has talked a lot about that, but I just wanted to show this again. These are two trends. This is the one for political polarization that has been growing during the last several decades. And then I put here also on the graph the dissemination of false information that was particularly happening during the Trump presidency. And then what you see, this is the general trend that we have seen in other countries as well, is that dissemination of false information goes up, and at the same time political polarization goes up. So here, just to interpret, because it measures the vice versa. So when it goes down, it means it's getting worse for dissemination of false information. So these trends are related. And again, for political polarization, we are still there. So it's something that is driving the debate. This is driving also these elections. And what has been happening in the US is basically what we see is that the US is part of a global wave. So this is the same that was happening in many other countries. This is from from this year's democracy report, the data, just to show you some specific sub-indices of democracy that go into democracy index that were declining. This is for 2013. This was what was happening 10 years ago. And the graph shows you how many countries were improving and declining on each of these sub-indices. And if you're above the line, that means that the sub-index is improving in more countries than it is declining. So 2013, most of them, except for deliberation, were above the line. And this is just to compare to 2023. Almost all of them are down. And the worst affected here are clean elections and freedom of expression. So again, this is something to keep in mind, that the US now is a part of a global trend. Again, with the indicators that were declining, top 20 declining indicators globally, we see that it is spread of misinformation, freedom of expression, and then something that we saw only during the last 2 years is that clean elections, or some indicators of clean elections, are declining globally. Again, this is something that gives you the perspective in which context elections in the US were happening, global context. One more trend that was discussed here is what was happening with disinformation, polarization, and autocratization globally. And you see on your on the left, you see this graph for disinformation on 2012 compared to 2022, and on the right-hand side is political polarization in countries. And then for polarization, again, if you're above the line, that means that things are getting worse. And for countries that are colored in red, that means that country is also in a decline on democracy index compared to where it was 10 years ago. And what you see with the US for political polarization is that the US is not only declining, it is in this upper third of the graph. And if it is in the upper third of the graph, we are usually talking about toxic level of political polarization. So again, this is something that has already been mentioned. This is when you start to talk about your political opponents as your enemies. This discussion about polarization, where it is the choice between us and them. This is what is driving the debate. Two trends that were going at the same time, disinformation, polarization, autocratization. Again, this is just averages, just to show when disinformation goes up, false information, polarization goes up, and at the same time, country starts to autocratize. And the opposite, democratizing countries, they usually see decline in disinformation and polarization. Selective countries, again, this is from Democracy Report 2 years ago, where we see similar trends, countries that were autocratizing. So you see again the trend for the last 20 years, political parties' hate speech goes up, polarization of society goes up, and at the same time, liberal democracy index goes down. So this is what was happening in the US. Just, I mean, it's always context specific what's exactly is driving this, but the trend is something like US is part of a global trend. And the last thing, at the beginning of this year, we talked quite a lot about the year of elections, and we identified that more than half of all countries holding elections in 2024 were countries that were declining and on democracy level. So 31 countries are the ones that were declining, and only three of them were improving on democracy index. So just again, the context in which it was happening. And we are trying to predict some kind of outcomes, what it happens. And so far, it's very mixed results. I think some of you might have already read the article that Larry Diamond wrote in Foreign Affairs. Again, he seems to share these very ambiguous results in many countries, bad outcomes in terms of democracy levels. So we are talking about democracy here. quite bad outcomes in countries like Hungary, Georgia, again in Germany, and some outcomes that we tend to explain so far as good. So it's too early to say what happens with the democracy globally, but there are several things that I wanted briefly mention that would drive the debate. Is that if we talk about the US, it's mostly about the two discussions. It's actors and their interests and institutions. So if we are talking about actors, what will change, and this is something that has been mentioned here, is that the rhetoric will change. This will definitely change. And then again, we know that the Republican Party has also evolved a lot since the last Trump's presidency. So what we see, what we will probably see, is that there will be less people who will try to hold Trump back, who will mostly get into this Trumpism style of talking about different things. Whether policies will change, this is something that remains to be seen. And then we also see that in the US, much of the discussion about the defense of democracy, at least in my interpretation, will depend on other actors, how other actors and institutions will work. So, of course, there will be attempts to eliminate checks and balances, attempts to eliminate accountability further, and to weaken rule of law. But what will be decisive is how Congress, local government, business, civil society, and most importantly, the courts, how they will react to these attempts. So again, in terms of institutions, American democracy cannot be destroyed in a night, but the attempts to destroy it will be there. Globally, again, there will be still domestic factors that will drive the change and that will drive the change for democracy levels in many countries. So that will again be rising polarization, inequality, some economic factors, sometimes migration. But internationally, what we will probably see is that the US support of democracy will become, at least in my understanding, most based on strategic interests. So it will be more strategic interest, more selective in terms of on which countries to focus, in terms of which countries are important with economic and security, for economic and security concerns. And it will be less, so it may affect some democracies that are very fragile if you are not in this epicenter of economic strategic interests. Then, of course, there will be some changes with economic in economic sphere, like tariffs. What we will see in NATO is probably that allies will have to think on how to become more dependent on themselves. And also, we know that that Trump thinks that he can make some deals with autocrats. So we don't know, but I mean, it's at least the discussion that I see in the Russian media right now is that among the Russian population, people are just so happy about the Trump election because they see that this is the only way for the war in Ukraine to end. And this is something, again, might be something that drives the debate. What has changed, and again, just to keep in mind, is that the international landscape has changed a lot during the last decades. This is, again, just to give a perspective. The left-hand side graph shows how much power, economic power, liberal democracy has right now. So we are losing, as liberal democracies, we are losing economic power, and we are losing this economic leverage that we have inside the world. The right-hand side graph shows the share of world trade that is happening between democracies and autocracies. And again, what it shows is that the trade between democracies is declining from 74% at the end of the 20th century up to 47%. That means the democracies are also becoming a lot more dependent on autocracies. And this is, again, and autocracies at the same time are becoming more self-sufficient. Again, something to keep in mind. The discussion that we have for BRICS Plus. Again, at least in my understanding, that will shape the debate. The immediate consequences might not that are critical, but long-term consequences, they may kind of be quite severe. So the left-hand side graph shows you what was happening with share of world GDP produced by G7 compared to BRICS, under BRICS Plus. So G7, the share of world GDP produced by G7 is declining from 68 up to 44% in 2023. At the same time, BRICS Plus countries, they are growing, have almost tripled. And at the same time, the right-hand side graph shows you what's happening with level of democracy in BRICS countries. And you see that BRICS Plus is almost a fully established club of autocracies, with the exception of Brazil and South Africa. All other countries, this is the average liberal democracy index for BRICS Plus, is slightly above 0.2. So it's almost an established club of autocracies that are now kind of cutting their own deals, which means that in international arena, the world most probably will become more polarized. And again, for the European Union, here we, as people who are based, like I'm based in Sweden, so we talk about like what Trump presidency will mean for the European Union. And for quite some time, European growth strategy was reliant on three things. It was quite reliant on the US security guarantees, it was reliant on Russian provision of oil and gas, and it was reliant on Chinese markets. And what we saw during the last several years, and these two things are gone, so we cannot be dependent on Russian energy, we cannot focus on it anymore, and then Chinese markets are also not there anymore. And this is like with Trump presidency here in the European Union, we have this question mark whether we can still rely on the US security guarantees. So that's again the discussion. Not that it depends on Trump only, because Trump is not the only there are also institutions who decide that, but again, that's something that is critical for the future of the European Union. And finally, the question that,
could you please wrap up?
Yep. Finally, the question that we have on the agenda and that we talk about quite a lot is what liberal democracy has to offer to the world. And what we saw is that the narrative, narrative is that populist parties and also autocrats, they have been very good with presenting a narrative that they can solve of many different problems. And then we here as liberal democracies, we should come with some counter narrative, and we should be also as persuasive as populist leaders in this sense. And this is why I put this dividends of democracy as a question mark, because we have been dealing with this in the V-Dem Institute during the last several years, since the time when the European Commission approached us with this question. And we started to produce some reports. The one from Case for Democracy report, this one was commissioned by the European Commission in terms of what kind of dividends democracy has to offer. On the right-hand side, you see a similar report, but with a focus on media freedom, democracy, and security. This is the one that we developed together with OSCE. Again, it's published on their website. And just to show briefly, we are starting to produce these policy briefs with what kind of dividends democracy has to offer, again, based on research findings. And here I stop. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And that brings us to our question and answer session. So I would appreciate if we could keep our questions and answers as much short as possible, so we can have more room for discussion for different topics. Yes.
I'd like to just mention that there's hardly any reference to the political structure in the United States. The Trump would not be possible without the Republican Party. He captured it, which it and made use of it, and the Republican Party had moved more and more to be anti-government, and particularly self-serving. And I think the idiosyncrasies of the United States are profound, as well as the similarities. Thank you.
Anyone willing to make a comment? Please go ahead, Dr. John. Dr. McCoy, please go ahead.
Yes, I did refer to this briefly in my presentation, that the two-party system has enabled both things. It means that somebody like Trump can capture it if the party goes along, and that's partly a result of our primary system, the way it works, and then can continue. And as I said, I think that the change vote, there was no choice for people who wanted change, but were not necessarily for Trump and what he stands for, but wanted change, and therefore he has. So I do agree, the institutional structure, the party system, the electoral system, many things do contribute to that. And I think that we need some change, some updating of the US institutional system.
Dr. Pally?
Yeah, similarly, I briefly noted, building on Jennifer's remark, that the outcome now may be much, much broader and deeper policy change, given in comparison to the very small margin of victory for the Republican Party owing to the two-party system.
Question from Irina von Wies, please.
Yes, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Also, on behalf of the ECPS, I am the honorary president, and I also teach populism and politics in London and Berlin. I have a question really for all speakers, and that is in how far you attribute this rather sorry state that democracy finds itself in to the failure of liberal democracies, and in particular to the economic failure of liberal democracies, where people do not see, particularly the younger generation does not see that their lives are getting any better. Thank you.
Dr. Pally?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. This is also, in answer, it's why I emphasized the role of manifold sources of duress on the American public and on particularly white evangelicals as a subset of the American public. And so we have two outcomes of 45 years of economic way of life and status loss, duress and destabilization. One of those outcomes is the sense of representational deficiency, where, as I briefly mentioned, people don't feel that they can access or have any influence on the representatives, that their representatives in government do not effect policies that benefit them. The second outcome is what I call effectiveness deficiency, that people simply don't feel they can do anything to better their lives. And that drives people to the political extremes precisely because they feel and see that, or feel that the mainstream governance mechanisms are not handling accumulated duresses in the United States, certainly since the Reagan era.
Well, I just want to answer. I didn't see the hand up thing here, but I mean, one thing, this answers, I think, speaks to both of the last two questions and also works with the last, my colleagues' comments here. I mean, it is, yes, it's the Republican Party, but and certainly there are economic issues, but it's really actually quite extraordinary that the events of January 6th, which everyone saw on television, was not the least bit disqualifying for Trump. And it makes one wonder about, not only the failures of our economic system, but the failures of our educational system, so that we have also taught people or that there is nothing valuable in democracy. It's more than simply losing one's economic position, although that's very important. But I think that's a really extraordinary thing that does fit in with Professor Kreisberg's statement and the last speaker's statement too. So I think that's worth considering. It's something that I certainly think about a lot, and it's sort of gone by a lot of the commentary, not only here, but I think it's really something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Moore?
I just wanted to add briefly that I think the narrative has to change, because at some point I think we have started to take democracy for granted. So essentially what we saw in the US, that was the choice between like money and values, right? So it's between economy and values. And this is something that democratic values have lost this debate, and this is something that has to change in terms of how we speak about democracy, how the democracy as such is valuable, something that probably should go into education, the narrative, or something like this. This is something that has completely this is where democracy is losing at the moment. That's at least my understanding. Yeah.
Thank you. Question from Neo, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aslan. Thank you, presenters, for your amazing speeches. I have loads of notes. I have one quick question towards Dr. Norrid and Dr. Berezin. Concerning the EU and the EU's relationship with the USA and transatlanticism. His second coming finds the EU at a very critical time, where it's fighting the rise of the far right, combined with democratic backsliding and a fracturing within the bloc as a whole. So I'd like to know if I'm not sure, your predictions for either a drop in transatlantic interests, or if the EU become a lot more independent of the US, going past the next 4 years, if this will, ignite, really solidify EU interest towards common security, and a more independent EU policy towards the world as independent of the US.
Unmute, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I mean, I think the EU has its own problems, as I'm sure you know, and this is an old argument from back when Trump was president the first time, but one would think that that would be the direction it would go in. And also, as you correctly point out, the EU has its own issues with the kind of right-wing parties that I was talking about, the Marine Le Pens, although Maloney is actually they're all playing different games in a way, but certainly they have their own interests. So yes, they should propel them in that direction. Whether it will is another story. Probably will if they're to stay together, but it's a guess.
Yeah, just to add briefly, I mean, I totally agree with what Mabel has said. It's just, I think both the EU and the US will lose a lot if they go different ways. So they are kind of, in terms of at least security, they're a lot stronger together. And I think this is something that should not be forgotten. Because if we are going to a more fragmented world, then as I showed with the data, we are already, like, even combined liberal democracies are losing in terms of like both economic power and military power. And if there are also divisions within the liberal democracy bloc, then kind of it only empowers it, because that's what we see on the other side, that autocrats are now building their own blocs. So just to keep in mind this thing.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I think we can wrap up our session, and I actually tried to take some notes from the presentations. If I may, I'm going to conclude by reading from my notes with these wonderful presentations from our experts. So Dr. McCoy actually, she said the main reason for this election result was the change, the request for change because of the unpopular incumbent. Actually, several other speakers pointed that, Biden's popularity issue was a big factor in the outcome of this recent presidential election. And Dr. McCoy sees high risks for US democracy, and because there will not be much accountability for Trump. But we don't still know how much he will carry out his threats to the democracy. Obviously, potential corruption is something that she pointed out. But there are some dangers she pointed out, to women's health, public health, climate change, to multilateralism, and populism will be emboldened. But there are also some good news, according to Dr. McCoy. Crisis might bring opportunity for reform. Trump maybe could moderate. There are a few things that can be good news. And with Dr. Abramowitz's presentation, again, he pointed out how unpopular Biden was, and Harris had a difficult environment, and voters perceived high inflation, although there was some, improvements on that. That was the perception of most of the voters who voted for Trump, and so they were unhappy. He argued it was a close election. Electoral college margin is higher, but it was very close, and popular vote is also close. It's going to get closer when we hear from the latest results from California. There is a consistency, he points out, with Democratic presidential candidates. There's a decline. He showed us some, graphics on that, and he pointed out correlations, a high degree of consistency between election results. So what changed? Turnout was an important factor in this election, and Democratic turnout fell sharply. Democrats in 2020 turned out higher. There's like about 5 points swing in margin with turnouts. That's another important factor with the election result. And for the future, Trump is going to be less popular in the second term, and midterm elections, Democrats historically, when a president controls the White House, his party loses next midterm elections. And so he had a very interesting prediction. He's thinking maybe Chelsea and Ivanka will be the next presidential candidates for the United States. We'll see if it happens. And Dr. Pally talked about policy shifts, rhetoric and promises, the difference between rhetoric and promises, and her presentation was basically focusing on American evangelicals, and her main point was American evangelicals are Americans, so they will share similar resentments, similar concerns with many of the Americans, but on the top of those stresses, they have their own stresses. So it's a double stress for American evangelicals. So they have a response to duress, and this is humanity's defense mechanism. She mentioned populism background for evangelicals, some of the points like covenantal political theory, republicanism, liberalism, anti-authoritarian, localist approaches, and government awareness. And there are some historical examples that she gave. Obviously, we have a polarized society in the United States, and Trump used effectively suspicion of government and outsiders, which is not new in the United States historically. And Dr. Berezin talked about anti-democratic trends in Europe, and there were some dangerous turning points, including triple crisis of 2015, and security crisis contributed to this. Trump is not a European-style populist, according to Dr. Berezin, because European-style populists' moves are more predictable, and they want actually, especially in Western Europe, more government, not less government in the United States. In Central Europe, populists don't need Trump, but there are some similarities, and they actually have some safeguards in their own countries. Even if Harris won, there were dangers for United States. but this is not a mandate, as some of our speakers pointed out. And there's also no evidence for special Trump agenda. There is no personal master plan, but Dr. Berezin says there might be a master plan by people around him instead of Trump. Some of the points that she pointed out was judicial realignment and intellectuals, institutions, and especially the paramilitary element that she is concerned about. So she's concerned this win and this trend is going to give more legitimacy to paramilitary groups. And institutional threat is also something she points out, and she thinks it's even more dangerous than the others. And law is being used as a weapon. For the future, I mean, we're going to see if his threats to this democracy by Trump is going to be carried out. So this is not a full mandate, but guardrails are going to be weaker. And Dr. North talked about, how the world is getting actually more and more authoritarian, thanks to the research she shared with us. And there's a lack of integrity, and there's dissemination of false information and political polarization, and which goes up together. There's a correlation between them. And freedom of expression and election is going worse in the world and in the United States. So US is in line with the global trends on this. And when this disinformation increases, polarization increases. That's another correlation. And in 31 countries, there's a decline in democracy. In elections, there's only 3 improvements in their research. So for Trump's policies, it's not clear. Again, she pointed out what we're going to see. And she thinks institutions in the US cannot be destroyed overnight. They are robust enough, but they're going to be challenged. And democracies are losing economic leverage. And when we see countries like BRICS countries and other authoritarian countries, their economic influence and their self-sufficiency among themselves is increasing. That's another concern. And European reliance on US, security guarantees, we don't see a future very well on that. That's one thing left maybe for Europe. And I guess that's all. If I could summarize, if I did any disservice to your presentations, please forgive me. And this was a wonderful experience for me. I learned a lot, and I'm sure all the participants learned a lot from you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Aslan, for your moderation. I need to hijack you for like 2 seconds. Thank you for our panelists and esteemed guests, panelists and presentation, guests for your attention. Really thought-provoking stuff. I appreciate the insights. Keep in mind that this panel and the report will be released shortly. After this panel, will post this proceedings onto YouTube channel. So please do go onto YouTube channel or our website to find this panel and previous panels as well. Mark your calendars. We have 2 upcoming events. The first is on the 20th of November. We're launching an ECPS book talk on peacemaking and peace building in South Africa, which looks at the National Peace Accord between 1991 and 1994. Really thought-provoking book discussing South Africa's transition and how it moved, from update in towards democracy, November 20th at 6 p.m., I believe. And then we have on November 28th, our 17th Mapping Global Populism panel, which is on the rise and reign of autocratic populism in the Islamist nationalism in Turkey. Thank you again for your attention and your time. As far as I'm aware, that's all from ECPS. Have a lovely evening and a great weekendish, and we hope to see you again soon.